I came home after a surgery that left me unable to ever become a mother. The moment I reached the door, my husband threw a divorce paper, a suitcase, and $98 onto the table. His mistress gave me a scornful smile and said, "Get out. I'll give him a child." I walked away in pain and then discovered a gift my father had left behind, one that not only shocked me, but left them both speechless. I stepped out of the car slowly as the Uber pulled up to the gate of the 3-bedroom house in Fishtown, Philadelphia, on a cold gray afternoon, limping like someone who had just crawled out of an abyss, even though in truth, I had just spent 3 weeks hovering between life and death in a hospital. A ruptured ectopic pregnancy at midnight had caused me to lose nearly 3 liters of blood, and the grapefruit-sized fibroid that had pressed against my side for the past 3 years had finally forced the doctors to remove my entire uterus and 1 fallopian tube to save my life. I woke up with my stomach tightly bandaged in white, heard the doctor tell me I would never be able to become a mother, and realized that in all those 3 weeks, I had seen Josiah, my husband, only once. After that, not a single call, not a single message to ask how I was. When I opened the door, the first thing I saw wasn't my husband. It was Chloe Grant, his mistress, standing in the kitchen I had painted mint green with my own hands. She was flipping something in a skillet like it was her house, flashing a paper-thin smile as she looked me up and down, while Josiah stepped out of the living room with a face that showed no surprise, placing a stack of papers on the table in front of me. Divorce papers, and a waiver relinquishing all marital assets, the very document I had signed while delirious from painkillers on the 6th day in the hospital, when he told me it was just insurance paperwork. I stood frozen, unable to tell what hurt more, the stinging surgical wound or the realization that he had deceived me while I was lying on a hospital bed. He told me I could only take 1 suitcase and exactly $98, the amount I had just made from selling one of my paintings at the South Street Art Market before I was admitted. Then he admitted that during the first 3 critical days when I was in the emergency room, he hadn't come because he was on a work trip, but in fact, he was in Atlantic City with the very woman now standing in our kitchen. I didn't even have the strength to cry. I just clutched my burning abdomen and walked out of the house I once believed would be where I became a mother, the place where I had hung countless paintings from 12 years of marriage. That afternoon in Philadelphia was so cold the wind cut through my thin hospital gown, still tinged with the scent of disinfectant, and I knew I had nowhere to go. I climbed into my father's old pickup truck, the only thing Charles Hartley left me before he passed away. 17 years old now, it still carried the smell of worn leather and pine wood from the days he used to haul his carpentry tools. That first night, I curled up in the back seat, the sound of rain pounding the car windows waking me in waves of cramping pain, as if my body were reminding me that I had permanently lost the ability to be a mother. I switched on the car light, reaching for the painkillers, when I noticed an old envelope, its corners frayed, with my father's familiar handwriting. "When you're in despair, take this to Thomas, Flushing Bank." Inside was only a single bank card and a small piece of paper. I let out a bitter laugh in the skin-splitting cold. Maybe he left me a few $100s in case things got hard, but no one could have guessed that the first true moment of despair in my life would come so mercilessly. I folded the envelope, held it close to my chest like the last trace of my father's warmth, not knowing that tomorrow, just 1 day from now, my entire life would change course. The next morning, as the thin winter sunlight filtered through the truck's windows, I slipped on my hospital gown, still smelling faintly of antiseptic, sat behind the wheel, and drove toward Center City, the location of the Flushing Bank branch my father had mentioned. I drove slowly. Each bump in the crowded Philadelphia streets sent sharp jabs of pain through my lower abdomen. In the rearview mirror, I saw my own pale face, dry lips, messy hair. I looked like someone who had escaped from a hospital. From time to time, I had to pull over, breathe deeply to let the pain subside, but my hand never let go of the envelope, like it was the only thing keeping me from collapsing entirely. When I walked into the vast lobby of Flushing Bank, the space felt too bright, too clean. I felt like a stain in it all. My light blue hospital gown stood out sharply among the suits and business dresses. The receptionist looked me over, her expression puzzled, as if trying to figure out whether I had wandered in from a shelter or needed a hospital. "Can I help you? We have a program to assist patients post-surgery if you're going through hardship." All I could do was offer a tired smile and place my father's worn bank card on the counter. "My father is Charles Hartley. I need to speak with Thomas Harrington." The air shifted instantly. The receptionist froze for half a second, then glanced quickly at her colleague before lowering her voice into the intercom. In the open lobby, I could feel eyes turning toward me. No one could make sense of why a pale woman in a hospital gown was asking to see the CEO of Flushing Bank. Less than 2 minutes later, a middle-aged man in a gray suit came briskly out of the elevator. His eyes landed on me, and confusion quickly turned to shock when he read the name on the card. "Aurora! Hartley?" I nodded, breathing shallow and slow. Without another word, he smiled gently, the kind of smile people wear when they recognize someone they've waited a long time to meet, and said, "Please, come upstairs. I'm Thomas Harrington." The meeting room on the 12th floor was large, but so quiet I could hear the footsteps of the young assistant as he entered. He placed a thick navy blue folder in front of me, its cover marked, "Hartley Trust, 0007. My heart pounded violently. For some reason, my hands trembled so much I nearly dropped the pen Thomas handed me. He sat down across from me, his hands placed carefully on the table, as if preparing to say something of grave importance. Then he opened to the first page, turned the folder toward me, and said in a quiet voice I will never forget, "Aurora, your father left you over $25 million in this trust." I froze. Every sense stretched into a dry, unbearable silence. My mind filled with images of my father, Charles Hartley, the wiry man in a worn flannel shirt, his hands rough from a life of woodworking, who never once bought a new suit for himself, but always found a way to save money to buy me paint as a child. The room around me faded. All I could hear was my own uneven breath. I wanted to ask something, say anything, but my throat was so dry, no words came. I didn't even realize I had collapsed into the chair, arms wrapped around my abdomen, as if to keep the stitches from bursting open again. Pain shot from the wound to my chest, making me double over. Thomas stood, gently placed a hand on my shoulder, and whispered so softly only I could hear, "Your father loved you more than anyone I've ever known, and he prepared everything for the day you'd need it most." I closed my eyes and let the tears fall for my father's love, and when I opened them again, Thomas was already sitting back across from me, as if he knew this was the moment I needed to hear it all. "Aurora," he began, voice slow but steady, "your father, Charles Hartley, was one of the most resolute men I've ever met." I looked up, my chest tightening with emotion. Thomas opened a secondary folder, turned it toward me, and pointed to a familiar date. March 2009. "This is the day your father sold the old family farm in Hudson Valley. At the time, it was worth exactly $100,000. My heart skipped a beat. That farm was where he once said he wanted to take me in the summer to paint wild daisies, but life had been too hard. He never had the chance. Thomas continued. He came to see me on a rainy afternoon. His clothes were soaked, his hands still dusty with wood. He placed the envelope on my desk and said, "I don't need it for me. I just want my daughter to have something, if I'm not here." My throat closed. Charles, the man who wore faded flannel shirts all his life, who never bought himself a proper dinner, had taken the largest sum he ever earned and handed it to Thomas to invest. And not for himself, but for me. Thomas flipped to the next page, filled with detailed figures. He asked me to divide the money into 3 investments: Apple, Amazon, and Berkshire Hathaway. That was at the height of the financial crisis. Everyone was panicking, selling everything, except Charles. He paused, locking eyes with me. He wasn't just brave. He saw a future that few dared to. I clenched my hands, remembering all the nights my father came home from long shifts, hands shaking from using the saw all day, yet still managed to smile and ask, "What did you paint today?" I never knew he was silently gambling everything he had on my future. What's most remarkable, Thomas continued, is that for the 2 years that followed, even though he lived with so little, he never withdrew a single cent. I stared at him, barely able to believe it. Thomas said there was even a time when the bank reminded him he could pull out a support amount if needed. Charles just smiled and said, "No, I'm leaving it for my girl. One day, she'll need it." Then Thomas lowered his voice, softened with gravity. "Aurora, your father passed away just 2 years after the trust was created. He never got the chance to tell you or to see what the investment would become, but he left one final instruction. This trust is untouchable. Only you can access it, and no one else, not even your husband." I sank into the chair, overwhelmed by grief and gratitude. The hollow inside me seemed filled by a different kind of light, quiet, enduring, the love of a father who didn't speak much, but loved his child with everything he had. In that moment, everything broken in Philadelphia, every betrayal, every wound, felt smaller than the one truth I could hold on to. My father never left me alone in this world. And as I sat there, my body still lightly trembling from everything Thomas had just told me, he stood up, pulled an old business card from a desk drawer, and placed it in my palm like the final piece of a story my father never got to finish. "Aurora, after you leave the bank, there's someone you should meet," he said. "Mrs. Marlene Whitford. She was Charles's childhood neighbor. She happened to move back to Philadelphia to be near her son and has come here several times to ask about your trust, just to make sure we were honoring Charles's wishes." Her name was printed in blue ink, the edges of the card slightly curled as if it had been held many times. I stared at it for a long while, gently tracing the letters like I was touching a piece of my father's memory. When I left the bank, I didn't head back to the truck right away. I stepped out under the awning, gathered my breath, and dialed the number on the card. As the call began to connect, I took a deep breath and introduced myself. "This is Aurora Hartley, Charles' daughter." On the other end, there was a short silence, the kind that happens when memories return faster than words. Then the voice of an older woman came through, raspy but warm like a sip of hot tea. Good heavens, that really is Aurora's voice. I knew it. "Charles, girl, you finally called." Her voice trembled, not from frailty, but from real emotion. "Charles would be so happy to know you reached out. Come by this afternoon. I have something he left for you." My father's old truck coughed to life with its familiar heavy rattle, but that sound gave me more comfort than anything had in days. I drove through the quiet neighborhoods of North Philadelphia, where old wooden houses lined the streets and fallen yellow leaves blanketed the sidewalks. When I reached Mrs. Marlene's small cream-colored home, I shut off the engine and paused to collect myself. The door opened just as I approached. Mrs. Marlene stood there, her silver curls soft like clouds, her pale blue eyes so familiar they made my throat tighten. "My goodness, little Aurora," she said, voice trembling. "You look just like your mother. But your eyes, they're all Charles." She led me into a living room that smelled of cinnamon tea. On a low wooden table was a walnut box, hand-carved, clearly my father's craftsmanship. She placed the box in my hands with trembling fingers. "He gave this to me for safekeeping," he said. "One day the girl would need it more than anything else." I lifted the lid and my heart squeezed tight. Inside was a folded letter, the handwriting so unmistakably my father's that just seeing it stung my eyes. Beneath it lay an old map of Hudson Valley, its edges yellowed and brittle, marked with my father's notes in pencil. I opened the letter, my breath catching in my throat. "My Aurora, when you have lost everything, return to where I was born to find your strength. There are things you can only see when you stand where your father's heart began." I clutched the letter to my chest, feeling as though my father stood behind me, his hand on my shoulder, And for the first time in weeks, I no longer felt adrift. But that warmth lasted only until I turned back toward the old truck and caught my own hollow face in the reflection of the window. I understood. If I was to move forward, I had to cut ties with the toxic past Josiah had created. I opened my phone and searched for the best divorce attorney in Philadelphia, someone strong enough to pull me out of the trap Josiah had set while I was unconscious in a hospital bed. That afternoon, I met Daniela Ortiz, an Irish-born lawyer known across the city's divorce courts as a nightmare for deceitful husbands. Her office was on the 7th floor of an old building near Rittenhouse Square, its walls covered with photos from cases she'd won. Women standing beside her, their eyes light with relief like they'd escaped prison. Daniela looked me over in my oversized sweats, pale face, hands still trembling from painkillers. "I've heard about Josiah Palmer," she said bluntly. "The kind of man who thinks he's smarter than the law, but really just waits to strike when a woman's at her weakest." I handed her the stack of papers I'd been tricked into signing while barely conscious. Daniela skimmed them for exactly 10 seconds before looking up, voice sharp as a scalpel. "Void. You lacked legal capacity at the time of signing. No witness. No video confirmation. Not valid by any standard." She set the documents down, laced her fingers together, and said, "Now we strike back." In less than an hour, Daniela had filed an emergency motion with the Philadelphia Family Court to freeze all of Josiah Palmer's accounts, including subsidiary accounts from the real estate firm he managed. "If he thinks he's getting a cent from you, he's in for a shock," Daniela said, as she signed the motion with a decisive stroke. "We'll shut it all down before he even knows what hit him." But what chilled me most was what Daniela found when she ran a background check on Josiah. She turned her laptop screen toward me. "Aurora, this is a report from a private investigator named Kyle Simmons, hired by Josiah 6 months ago. He had someone tracking any assets under your name." My eyes widened at the screenshot. Josiah's signature, my address, it was all real. He had suspected I had money I didn't even know existed and had been preparing to steal it all along, waiting until I was at my weakest, completely powerless. A cold shiver ran down my spine. All those nights he clutched his phone in secret, all those last-minute business trips, even his annoyance when I mentioned selling a painting for a few $100s, it had all been part of a plan. He had smelled money from somewhere, and he was getting ready to take it before I even knew it was mine. Daniela placed her hand gently but firmly on my arm. "Aurora, you don't have to run anymore. Now it's his turn to face everything." I nodded, though a chill still crept through me. Something unexplainable. It felt like the truth had all come to light, but that calm sky lasted only a few hours. As I stepped out of the law office, my phone buzzed in my pocket. Unknown number. I hesitated for a second, then picked up. "Hello?" A young man's voice, low, panicked, hoarse like he'd been running. "Ms. Aurora Hartley? Please don't hang up. I'm Daniel Alvarez. I used to work at Josiah Palmer's company." At the mention of that company, my heart skipped. I froze in place on the sidewalk, Philadelphia's crowds streaming past me like rushing water, yet the world blurred. "What do you want from me?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm while my heart pounded. Alvarez swallowed audibly, then said, I think you need to know this. I just left the company, and I have an audio file. Once you hear it, you'll understand why." He sent the file via text. The download icon spun, once then settled. I leaned against the brick wall of a coffee shop, my hand trembling as I pressed play. It took only 2 seconds for me to recognize Josiah's voice, the voice of the man who used to be my husband, who I trusted for 12 years. But in the recording, his voice was cold as stone. "If Aurora doesn't make it through the surgery, that'd really simplify things." I clenched the phone so tightly, my knuckles turned white. Then came Chloe's voice, messy and cruel. "Yeah, then you won't have to worry about splitting assets. If she just dies, that saves a lot of hassle." I heard Josiah chuckle softly, careless, quiet, but enough to freeze my entire body. Whatever happens, happens. The doctor said survival chances for that complication are pretty low anyway. I don't know how long I stood on that sidewalk. All I remember is the icy chill down my spine and tears that fell not from pain, but from being crushed once more by the cruelty of someone I once loved. I had been on the operating table, fighting for my life, and they were already discussing whether I'd live or die like I was a burden, a debt to be cleared. Alvarez's voice came softly through the phone, full of guilt. I overheard them talking in the office. I couldn't work for Josiah after that. If you need evidence, I'll testify. I leaned back against the wall, breathing deeply to keep my balance. Do you know you just saved my life? A long pause. Then Alvarez replied, No, Ms. Hartley. You're the one saving other women from that man. I ended the call, hands still shaking. That audio wasn't just evidence. It was the raw truth of my marriage. I had died in their eyes long ago. Only my father, Charles, remembered I was still alive. And right at that moment, standing on a crowded Philadelphia sidewalk, with traffic horns and hurried footsteps swirling around me, I felt something undeniably clear. It was time to return to where my father's heart began, Hudson Valley. 2 days later, I boarded a train to New York with just 3 things: my father's letter, the old envelope with its frayed corners, and the map of the farm Mrs. Marlene had given me. I arrived at the Newburgh station on a foggy morning. The air in Hudson Valley was nothing like Philadelphia, cool, green, and quiet, as if every wound could finally breathe here. The old taxi drove through tree-lined roads, the breeze rich with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The very smell my father loved so much, he once said it reminded him he was still a decent man. The farm appeared beyond a line of pines, a 2-story brown wooden house, wide porch, wild daisies blooming freely just as he once described. Standing before it, I could almost hear Charles's deep laugh somewhere in the breeze. The wooden door opened, revealing an older man with silver hair and a kind, weathered face. "Are you Aurora Hartley?" he asked, voice firm but warm. I nodded. He brought me inside and offered a seat at an old wooden table, cross-cut with saw marks. Enough for me to know. This was the table my father once built with him. "I'm Samuel Hayes," he introduced himself. "Your father was a good man, a man who saved my wife's life." He paused, then continued. "She had a saw accident in 2008. No one dared go near the machine. The blade was shaking violently. Only Charles ran in, using his bare hands to shove it aside. If it weren't for him, I'd have been a widower 15 years ago." I sat in stunned silence. My father had never told me this. He was the kind who quietly did the right thing and treated it as nothing. Samuel stood and handed me a small folder. "I've kept this farm for 15 years, but if Charles' daughter wants it, I'll sell it back. No price hike. $2.5 million. I know your father would have wanted you to have it." I didn't hesitate. No paperwork check, no negotiation. My father had led me here through shaky lines on old paper, and I knew. This was my next step. I agreed that same afternoon. The contract was signed on the very table my father once touched. When all was done, Samuel opened a drawer and retrieved a small item wrapped in cloth. He placed it gently in my palm, soft enough that I was afraid breathing might make me drop it. A pocket watch, silver now dulled with time, but the initials still engraved. C.H. Your father left this. He asked me to keep it and to give it back when the day came she needed it most. I opened the cover. Inside was a tiny photo of me at 6 years old, beaming, holding a box of paints, faded yellow with age. The hands of the watch had long stopped ticking, but my heart hadn't. I pressed it to my chest, feeling as though my father was holding me through the layers of time. I stood in the farmyard, whispering to my father, "I'm going to turn this place into the safe home we, and so many women, once dreamed of." But minutes later, as I held the pocket watch in my hand, I understood that to build anything new, I had to clear away everything rotten left behind. 2 days later, I left Hudson Valley, catching an Amtrak train back to Philadelphia. The rhythmic clatter of the train wheels sent a dull ache through my stomach with every vibration, but it didn't scare me anymore. I held my father's wooden box on my lap, watching the scenery roll backward through the window, knowing I was stepping into the next phase of this war. Back in Philadelphia, I didn't return to the old place in Fishtown. Instead, I rented a room at the Notary Hotel downtown. Small but clean, cream walls, a window facing City Hall, where the amber glow of evening lights lit the square like it was on fire. I spread out every document on the desk: Alvarez's audio recording, the file Daniel found about the private investigator Josiah hired, leaked internal emails Alvarez forwarded, and the bank transaction list my father had left me like the final puzzle piece. I called Daniela. She picked up after just 2 rings. "Are you ready?" she asked, voice sharp as steel. "I'm ready," I said, placing my hand on my chest to steady my breath. Daniela walked me through each step: how to wipe metadata, use a VPN, set up a burner email, and how to submit the thick dossier through the anonymous portal of the Bureau of Real Estate Fraud, the state agency that investigates property crimes in Pennsylvania. She warned me, once it's out, there's no turning back. That's when the wheel of justice starts rolling, and it rolls hard. I nodded, opened my laptop, took a deep breath. Then, one by one, the files were uploaded. The audio of Josiah and Chloe discussing whether I'd make it through surgery, altered accounting records, a list of clients overcharged, proof Josiah created shell accounts to embezzle escrow funds, photos of properties falsely appraised to skim profits. When I hit send, everything went silent. The mouse click was barely audible, but it felt like the sound of a massive door opening. I closed the laptop, resting my hand on the lid as if to hold the world steady. Daniela texted moments later. "Good, that part's done. Now we wait." Just 3 days later, the first tremor of the storm appeared. A rumor swept through Philadelphia's real estate circles, a major firm under secret investigation. Then came a message from Alvarez. "Chloe disappeared from the office. She's avoiding everyone." I stood on the balcony of the Notary Hotel, watching the cars below stream like tangled threads of light. And I knew Chloe was afraid. When the Bureau starts quietly gathering transaction records, interviewing old buyers, reappraising values, those in the crosshairs always feel it first. That night, Daniela called with news. "Chloe's not answering Josiah's calls. She's panicking now." I closed my eyes, feeling the cold wind slip through the window cracks, and for the first time in months, I no longer felt like the one who was running. I was someone stepping, inch by inch, onto the very path my father had spent his life clearing. But I didn't know that just 1 week later, the hammer of justice would fall so swiftly, even I would be stunned. That morning, just as I was pouring a cup of coffee in my room at the Notary Hotel, my phone started vibrating nonstop with messages. From Daniela, from Alvarez, even from Josiah's former coworkers. "Aurora, turn on the TV." I switched to the local channel, and the first image that hit me was the glass tower where Josiah's real estate firm was headquartered in downtown Philadelphia. Surrounded by at least 6 FBI vehicles, red and blue lights slicing across the glass, like a sharp wound in the morning. Agents in jackets marked FBI, Financial Crimes Division, filed into the building one after another, carrying brown evidence boxes. The reporter's camera zoomed in closer, capturing the panic on employees' faces as they were lined up to have their laptops inspected. Then I saw Chloe. She bolted out the back exit, hair disheveled, face tight with fear, her heel nearly snapping off as she staggered through the emergency door and disappeared into the narrow alley behind the building. No one had to tell me. Chloe had caught the scent of the storm coming from the documents I'd sent, and she had left Josiah behind. Seconds later, the camera panned again. Josiah was being led out the front entrance, his hands cuffed in front, face pale but still trying to wear a mask of calm. An agent gripped his shoulder firmly, guiding him through the press crowd, where questions flew like stones. Do you know how many counts you're charged with? How many properties did you fraudulently appraise? Did you embezzle escrow funds? Where is Chloe Grant? Any comments on the Bureau of Real Estate Fraud investigation? In that moment, I saw something I had never seen in Josiah before. Real fear. No more swagger, no more luxury watch, no more wedding ring he once wore to project a happy family. Just a man walking off a cliff of his own making. Daniela called me while I was still frozen in front of the screen. His company's assets have been frozen by court order. All accounts, personal and business, are locked. He's not getting back up from this. My heart felt heavy and light at once. Not because I found joy in seeing Josiah cuffed, but because I knew, without a shadow of doubt, that not a single cent of that money was mine, and not a single opportunity remained for him to lie to or harm another woman again. The final scene on TV showed agents pulling a tarp over the sign that once read, Palmer and Lowell Real Estate Group, like a burial shroud over the career Josiah once prized more than our marriage. I turned off the TV, leaning against the hotel room wall, breathing hard but lighter, and I knew this was only the beginning of his collapse. What I didn't expect was that just 3 days later, an even more bitter chapter would find its way to me. That morning, while I was making coffee in the wooden house at the Hudson Valley Farm, I heard the sound of a car screeching to a stop outside the old white fence. At first, I thought it was a local contractor coming to survey the land before renovation, but the harsh slam of a car door made me glance out the window, and when I saw that familiar black SUV, my heart froze. Josiah. Before I could react, he stumbled out of the car. No coat, no tie, face haggard like he hadn't slept in days. His hair matted with sweat, shirt wrinkled, eyes bloodshot. I knew immediately he'd been released on bail after an emergency hearing, likely scrambling for money in desperation. He staggered up the wooden steps, and before I could open the door fully, he collapsed to his knees on the porch, his trembling hand gripping the edge of the wood like he was about to fall apart. Aurora, I was wrong. Please, help me, just this once. His voice broke, caught in his throat like a drowning man reaching for a final lifeline. The light rain began to fall, clinging to his hair and shoulders, making him look so pitiful that if this had been 3 years ago, I might have rushed to lift him up. But I was no longer that woman. I stood still, hand on the doorframe. For a second, I truly looked at him, not with hatred, but with emptiness. The man who once said he loved me, who promised we'd face everything together, was now crumpled before me like a broken shard. I looked into his eyes and saw it all: fear, despair, and more than anything, the hollow realization of someone who once believed he could control the world. Aurora, I have no one left. The company, friends. Chloe's gone. They all left me. Don't leave me too, please. I didn't cry, didn't tremble, didn't rage. I just spoke the truth I had held in my bones since the day I lay on that hospital bed, in pain so deep I couldn't breathe. You left me when I was dying. Josiah froze, as if I had hurled the entire farm into his chest. I continued, my voice clearer than the rain pounding on the porch roof. Now live with it. No screaming, no arguing, no blame, just truth. I turned away, gripping the edge of the weathered door. He reached out to grab my leg, but I stepped back, soft but firm. Then I closed the door, the creak of its hinge echoing like the final punctuation. I didn't look back. I didn't shed a single tear. Outside, the rain poured harder, mingling with the sound of someone choking back tears on the porch. But that was no longer my concern. I stood inside the small wooden room, my breath steady after the door closed behind Josiah, and in that silence, I realized something clearer than I ever had before. The door I had just shut didn't just end a marriage, it opened an entirely new life. When the rain stopped and pale light streamed through the windows, I looked around the room still filled with the scent of fresh wood and the cinnamon tea Marlene gave me, and I knew I didn't just want to survive anymore. I wanted to build something for women like me who shouldn't have to die inside their own marriages. The next day, I called Thomas Harrington. He picked up with a calm, steady voice, as if he already knew what I was about to say. "I want to start an organization," I said, gazing at the field of white daisies behind the house. "Not for me, but for women abandoned by their husbands when they're at their weakest. Women with nowhere to go after losing blood, babies, or the will to live. I want them to have a second chance, the way my father gave me one." There was a pause. Then Thomas said, "Aurora, I'll be your first sponsor." Just one sentence, but it lit up the entire room. And so, the Second Chances Foundation was born, not in some pristine office, but right here at the wooden table my father once hoped I'd paint on, in the quiet heart of Hudson Valley. Over the next 3 weeks, I poured myself into drafting proposals, designing a brand identity, consulting with lawyers, opening a dedicated fund account, and transferring part of the Hartley Trust to seed operations. Daniela helped with legal documentation, and Thomas personally signed on as financial sponsor to fast-track approval. It felt surreal. During my old marriage, I had always shrunk myself just to survive. Now, I was at the front line, protecting women like me. The foundation focused on 3 main programs: safe haven housing, temporary rooms for women forced out after divorce, especially those pregnant or recovering from miscarriage; Legal Light, a volunteer legal team helping them understand their rights and avoid being tricked into signing anything while vulnerable; and Heartbeat Healing, mental health support, group therapy, and art therapy sessions. The very things I once needed but had no one to reach out to. On our opening day, I stood before 20 women, faces bearing the same exhaustion I once carried. They looked at me like they were silently asking if I truly understood. I stepped forward, no notes, no script. I placed a hand over my heart and said, "I know what it feels like to be left behind when you're dying. I know what it's like to walk out with just a suitcase and a few dollars, but I also know we can rise again, if someone gives us a second chance." One young woman burst into tears. Another nodded over and over. And in that moment, I understood. I was no longer Josiah's victim. I had become a guide. In the weeks that followed, I mentored many women who came to the foundation. I listened to stories of broken marriages, nights of fear, and contracts they were tricked into signing, just like I once had. I taught them how to protect themselves, love themselves, and stand up on legs that had once trembled. At night, I returned to the wooden house, opened the pocket watch my father left, and stared at the faded photo of my childhood self. He never got to see me this strong, but I knew he was watching, and as I lit the last lamp of the day and looked out over the wide fields before me, I knew. This was the life I had built, not from what Josiah left behind, but from what Charles had placed in my heart. 10 months later, what I once thought was an impossible dream became a reality so vivid that sometimes I had to touch the window to remind myself I was no longer living in pain. The Second Chances Foundation had supported over 80 women, each with her own story, her own wound, her own journey of rebirth. Many came to me in desperation but left with light in their eyes, the same light I once lost. Thank you letters now filled the wooden box beside the fireplace. Women who regained custody of their children, escaped violence, or stood strong after losing the ability to bear children, just like I had. Behind the cabin, the Hudson Valley homestead, the land my father once dreamed of bringing me to, had become a weekend gathering place for hundreds of children and the elderly. The laughter of children rang like tiny bells in the breeze, while the elders sat on wooden benches I had placed along the path, telling stories of harvests from long ago. I often stood quietly watching it all, wondering if Charles could see this, from wherever he was in the world beyond. As for me, I lived in the small wooden house beside the wild daisy field, where mornings woke me with the scent of damp soil and nights ended with golden light washing over the distant mountains. No more arguments, no more cold silence from a lifeless marriage, no one left to smother my dreams. Only wind, daisies, Henry, the cat I recently adopted, and the peace I had earned through tears. I was no longer the woman who once sobbed on the doorstep of our old house in Philadelphia. I was Aurora, the version Charles always believed I could become. And with every day that I saw myself changing, I felt more certain that my father was watching every step I took. One early autumn afternoon, I decided to drive to the small cemetery in Pennsylvania, where Charles was buried beneath an old oak tree he loved to lie under while reading the paper. I brought with me a bouquet of white daisies, the flowers now growing wild across the new farm, the same ones my father once said were strong because they bloom even in poor soil. The road to the cemetery was strewn with golden leaves, the sky clear and the breeze soft, as if nature itself had quieted down to make room for me. I knelt before his simple stone, laid the flowers down, and gently brushed the thin moss off the first letter. C.H. A warmth spread through my chest, not from the sun, but from memory, from calloused hands, from all the days he took me in his old pickup to buy cheap paint sets. I whispered, my voice shaking but no longer sad, "Dad, I can't have children of my own, but I've become a mother to many." Those words left my lips like a reply to the legacy he left me. Not wealth, not land, but the resilience to rise after what should have destroyed me. The wind swept across the small field beside the cemetery, rustling the white petals I had placed down, as if Charles himself was smiling, proud that I had finally found my home. That evening, back in Hudson Valley, I was hanging my coat when the chime of an email notification echoed from the little kitchen. The sender's name made my heart pause. Thomas Harrington. The message contained just one line that made me sink into the chair. "Aurora, your father left something else for you." Thomas never spoke in riddles, so I knew this wasn't just a document. I went to his bank the next morning, entering the archive room accessible only by special authorization. Thomas handed me a small golden key, then led me to a vault at the far end of the room. When the door opened, there were no financial documents or wills inside, just a dark brown leather notebook, its spine worn as though handled many times. I opened the first page, and my heart softened. My father's handwriting, neat, slightly slanted, chronicled every day he tracked the investment over 15 years. When Apple rose, when Berkshire fell, when Amazon split its stock. He even noted things like, "Wood's cheaper today, bought some extra to build a table for Aurora." Or, "She sent a new painting, still her favorite blue sky." I flipped to the final page, and the words there made me cover my mouth, tears rushing forth instantly. "Aurora will never be alone. My daughter is stronger than pain." I broke down, but for the first time in months, not from grief, but from witnessing, in full, the love Charles had given, not through grand words, but through quiet actions across a lifetime. He never had much, but what he left behind was enough to lift me up, enough to help dozens of other women rise with me. I held the notebook to my chest on the drive back to the farm, feeling as if I were carrying my father's heart home. That night, I placed it on the wooden table in the living room, right next to the pocket watch he had left, like pieces of him had finally found their way back together. One summer morning, before the sun had crested the distant hills, I stood on the wooden porch, the scent of wild daisies and pine sap drifting through the air. From the high porch, I looked out over the healing garden, women laughing, hands that once trembled with pain, now planting, watering, painting stones, each with her own story, each having fallen, now taking their first steps again. I leaned on the railing, letting the breeze brush my hair. My life had been cut in ways I thought would never heal. But in this moment, watching these women, those I had stood beside, held through collapse, listened to through their darkest nights, I realized something I was finally old enough to say out loud. Freedom is not about money. Freedom is becoming the person your father believed you could be. I stepped down from the porch and walked the worn path into the vast daisy field. The morning light bathed each petal in a soft glow, making them look almost illuminated. I stepped into the heart of the field, letting the flowers brush against my skin, These strong flowers that thrived even in poor soil and harsh winds. And in that exact moment, I knew I had found myself again. And from here, my new life begins. If Aurora's journey touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share this video so that more women can find strength and hope of their own. See you again in the next story.